Hello there, I'm Chuck Todd, and welcome to Meet the Press Reports. This, of course, is our last episode before Election Day 2020. And don't worry, we're certainly going to talk about that. But before we talk about the now, let's talk about 4 years ago. We're going to go deep on Election Day 2016. For nearly the entire race, Hillary Clinton appeared to be on track to win the presidency, and perhaps do so handily. Month after month, in poll after poll, Hillary Clinton seemed to hold a solid, if not commanding, lead over Donald Trump. Just what were the chances of an actual Trump victory? Well, by most accounts, it was infinitesimal. This was the New York Times election forecast, starting from the June 1st, 2016 starting point. At no point was Donald Trump ahead, not even close. Even on Election Day itself, the Times official forecast gave Clinton an 85% chance of winning. And they weren't alone. According to the Pew Research Center, with few exceptions, the final round of public polling showed Clinton with a lead of 1 to 7 percentage points in the national popular vote. And then, of course, we know what happened. And that begs the question, how on earth did the pollsters get it so wrong? It's a fair question, but allow me to offer a somewhat more controversial answer. They didn't. Many of us just missed the warning signs. The race was changing, and it was changing fast.
It was a little bit off, but this is a failure, Brett, of historic proportions.
The polls here got it wrong.
It's going to put the polling industry out of business.
It's a common narrative that the polls were wrong in 2016. But were they?
It actually was almost on average the same accuracy as we've seen in previous cycles.
A look back at the down-to-the-wire race shows national polls tightening as Election Day neared. We have a tightening race. Hillary Clinton now leading Donald Trump by just 4 points, to the point where the national average going into Election Day showed Clinton less than 4 points ahead nationally. Secretary Clinton actually won the popular vote by 2.1 percentage points.
In the midst of all the stuff that was happening, if you're a point and a half off the national vote, an average, you're doing a really, really, really good job. And what you're doing is really, really, really accurate.
Experts say battleground state polling is where that accuracy may have fallen short.
The polls were actually pretty accurate. But where the polls were off, obviously, is we don't elect presidents by who wins the most popular votes. It's the Electoral College. And yes, there were some problems with the polling in battleground states, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania.
In 5 battleground states, Trump beat Clinton, despite her leading in the polls. Many were close, some even within the margin of error. But late polling in Wisconsin, for instance, still had Clinton leading by 6 points in the final week of the race.
There may have been some systematic issues when it comes to underrepresenting white non-college educated voters in those states.
Clearly, the polls and the pollsters underestimated turnout from more rural and small town areas. We were going off of 2012 and 2008 turnout, and it was missing a segment of voters that had sort of cycled out of the electorate, and obviously, because of the unique nature of President Trump, cycled back in.
And a closer look at the states that ended up putting Trump over the top show a significant number of undecided voters who ended up breaking for Trump by double digits.
The people who made up their mind literally on Election Day or the last few days, guess where those numbers were the highest? Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania.
So with so many voters deciding late nationwide, major news stories that happened close to Election Day likely did have an impact that polls were unable to capture unless you kept polling through Election Day.
Director James Comey revealing that newly discovered emails have turned up that have FBI agents once again back on the trail of Hillary Clinton's use of a private email server.
Then, 2 days before the election, another Comey letter, this time exonerating Clinton. Still, it thrust the scandal back into the headlines.
Most people would say, well, geez, that it was so close to the election. How could it have made a difference? It made a tremendous difference.
State polls were not the only 2016 culprit, despite tightening national numbers and close battleground state polls. Most conventional election analysis made it seem like all signs were pointing to a Clinton victory.
I think she's got about a 95% chance in this election.
She's ahead. He's very unpopular. There was a tape of him saying something, Access Hollywood. He can't win. And that became the mindset.
In the last week, I had Trump 1 point ahead in Michigan. I had him 2 points down in Pennsylvania. My polling was right. I was wrong. I said, look, yeah, these races are very close. But to actually do the inside straight and like run the table and win all of them, that doesn't happen.
But it did.
The margin by which he lost the popular vote is the largest in history where he still won an electoral college majority. No one had ever seen it before.
This all led to a shocking election night.
This thing's far from over.
I don't know of one poll that suggested that Donald Trump was going to have this kind of night.
Guess what? He may just do it. So this time around, what's changed?
In 2016, there was not anywhere near the kind of state polling there's going to be in 2020. And the state polls were not, many of them did not weight by education.
In general, the nuts and bolts of polling, is it accurate? Is it reflective of public opinion? Is it done well? I would say in all three measures, we've gotten better and smarter than 2016.
More people have already voted by mail or early, and we expect a majority of voters, even in states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin this year, to have cast their vote before November 3rd. So there'll be less movement at the end.
But many Americans remain skeptical.
Just like 2016, I honestly don't trust the numbers.
I don't know whether to put a lot of faith in the polls.
I try taking it with a big grain of salt, just to be sure, because 2016 was scarring.
With me now are two top experts in the world of political polling, who also happen to run our NBC Wall Street Journal poll. It's Jeff Horwit of Hart Research, the Democratic firm, and Bill McIntyre of Public Opinion Strategies, a Republican firm. Gentlemen, let me start and frame the start of this conversation with this Nate Silver quote from May of 2018. About the real story of 2016. Certainly there were individual pollsters that had some explaining to do, especially in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, where Trump beat his polls by a larger amount. But the result was not some sort of massive outlier. On the contrary, the polls were pretty much as accurate as they've been on average since 1968. Bill, fair statement?
Yeah, that's a fair statement, but let's be true to your viewers. It's also fair for people to say this is not what they expected in 2016. I don't think here in NBC Wall Street Journal land we ever said 85%, but no, it was a surprising result. It's not what people expected, and we're still in that backwash after 4 years, and then one more chance to get it right in a couple of days.
You know, Jeff Horwit, my theory on all of this has always been we framed the narrative incorrectly. Generally, when I say we, the entire political community. We assumed the country was viewing the election as a referendum on Donald Trump's behavior, and it turned out had we framed the election as Hillary Clinton is the de facto incumbent, all of the same polling would have come out, and all of the analysis would have been different. Fair?
That's absolutely right. Look, the signs, when we look back at our polling, the signs were there. We had, unlike what we're seeing right now, we saw a race where both candidates were net negative, which was a warning sign for both of them, and particularly someone who was viewed as being an incumbent, being part of the establishment in Washington from an administration that had been in office for 8 years, right. And that her numbers, unlike this year, were moving in the wrong direction. And paying attention to that momentum at the end, those were really important signals, which the exit polls in those states that mattered really bore out.
All right, you both get the following question, I'm guessing, all the time. So, Jeff, I'll let you try to answer it first. Why should I believe the polls this time?
Well, again, I think it is, as we both know, Bill, more so than I do, in 2016 election, a great place to be a pollster on TV. And, I think it is a reminder of, look, the national polling was very accurate. And a reminder that people that Hillary Clinton did in fact win the popular vote nationally, and that there have been some corrections that have been made in these states that mattered. And one of them is that we're going to see a lot more polling, I would imagine, this weekend. The Marquette poll, for example, that you showed, right. It came out of the field on October 31st on Halloween. We had a week to go. And in Wisconsin, the late deciders in the exit poll broke to Trump by 27 points. So in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, there will be polls in the final week, rest assured.
Well, one of the editorial reforms we made at NBC News, for instance, is we have done a recontact survey. We're going to do a swing state. We're going to poll through Sunday night, something we didn't do before. But, Bill, answer that basic question when friends and family ask you, why should I believe you this time, Bill?
Well, at the NBC Wall Street Journal poll, we've done a lot to change, including using a registered voter sample. But Chuck, let me tell you what I tell people. What I say to them is, in this country, we've never had more than 138 million people vote. I think we're going to have 150 to 165 million. 9 states have sent out live ballots, including California, our largest state. Almost 2/3 to 3/4 of the states have changed election laws, making it easier to vote. So we're watching a level of composition of the electorate and turnout with new voter laws we've never seen. And as pollsters, we're really good at learning from experience and modeling from experience, but I'm describing an election that's never existed before in American history. And so I'm humble, we're cautious, we're doing the best we can. I think we're on the right track, but under those conditions, people have a right to be cautious, and I'm cautious about how well we're going to do in a very, very complicated situation. I think, though, that as we've been talking about, there are a lot of differences between 2016, but there's a lot of cautionary signs about how different this election is because of the coronavirus and because of the changes we made to election law and turnout.
I want to read you guys something that David Wasserman wrote earlier this month. And he noted this: an examination of state-level polling reveals a clear and crucial pattern. In both 2016 and the 2018 midterm elections, state polls chronically underestimated Republican strength in the Midwest and Florida. In this case, Florida sometimes acts like a Midwestern state, and underestimated Democratic strength in the Southwest. So then Wasserman goes on to say, it wouldn't be all that surprising if Biden defies polls by winning a higher share of the vote in Arizona than Wisconsin, or breaks through in Texas more than he does in Ohio. Jeff Horwitz, have you had this same experience? Your firm, you spend a lot of time in state-level races. Have you seen this phenomenon, or is this a public poll phenomenon?
Sure. No, it's a phenomenon if you don't go out of your way to make sure that voters who are harder to reach and harder to get into your samples are represented in the proper proportion in your polls. And so in the Midwestern states, we know that non-college white voters are harder to reach. They make up a higher proportion of the electorate in the Midwest. And the same pattern holds true in the Southwest and Florida for voters of color, who make up a higher proportion and are also harder to reach, particularly we are talking about Hispanic voters who are Spanish speakers. And so it takes more resources, more time, and obviously people who can speak the language and meet people where they are to engage them and get them into samples. And so that certainly does bear out if you don't take the extra effort and the extra cost to make sure that they're in your samples.
Right. And Bill, you do a lot of Arizona. Is this a phenomenon that you have to be experienced in polling that state to get it right?
Well, it helps. It always helps to have more data. But look, what's happened is Arizona's got almost a third of the electorate that's new since 2016. People are flooding into the state from California, and a lot of these people are in the mountain, all through the Mountain West, and in Texas. They're kind of the millennials and Generation Z. And then we have a higher Latino vote as kids age into the electorate. So what we considered Texas is a Republican state, Georgia's a Republican state, Arizona's a Republican state. Not anymore. They're changing, and they're changing a lot. They're changing very quickly. And so if you do these states, you're watching it live and kind of stunned by the margins by which these states are shifting demographically. And I think that's why, if you're not familiar with that, when you drop in to do kind of one poll, you kind of miss it because you're looking for an older Arizona that used to exist, not the new Arizona.
Jeff Horwitz, Bill McInturf, my partners in all of this. I have the full faith and credit of you two in this, and I look forward to Election Day with the both of you. I'm taking it to the bank. Anyway, Jeff Horwitz, Bill McInturf, thank you both.
Thank you,
certainly, not all polls are created equal, but figuring out which one are most likely to be accurate, it's not as difficult as you might think, as long as you know what to look for. When you read a poll, there are 3 things you should keep in mind. Who was asked to participate? How and when were they asked to participate? And what kind of questions were they asked? There are about 200 million Americans of voting age, but the average poll has a sample size of about 1,000 adults. That means only about 1 person in 200,000 people will be polled. Many state pollsters use voter file data that is maintained by the state government to estimate the composition of the electorate and pick which voters to poll. The problem? That state-maintained data is often extremely out of date or severely lacking in key data points, including education level. That was a huge issue in 2016. So to make up for samples that aren't as representative of a population as they should be, like a poll that has, say, too few women in it, pollsters sometimes assign weights to each of the 5 main variables: age, gender, race and ethnicity, education, and geographic region that correspond with data from the census. Now, to see how accurate a poll is, look to the data key. The more it's weighted, the greater the margin of error will be, and the less certain you should be in the results. But even if the weighting is correct, are pollsters talking to the right people in that said demographic group? Gallup found about 90% of registered voters tell interviewers that they're going to vote, and yet many don't. That makes the pollster's formula for figuring out who's likely to vote extra important for predicting an accurate result. For instance, our state pollster, Marist, uses this formula: how interested a person is in the election, how they would rate their chance of voting, and whether they've participated in similar elections in the past. But other political pollsters have their own formula, which could skew the results one way or another. Then there's how the polls are conducted. Many of the ways of contacting voters, like listed phone numbers and known billing addresses, they can be skewed towards the economically successful. Pew Research says more than 80% of U.S. public opinion polls are done through what's known as online opt-in polling, polls where participants volunteer their responses. And that makes sense because phone polling is expensive and requires additional manpower. But then your results are less certain. But in 2016, the online opt-in polling often missed voters with low levels of trust in the system who were likely to vote for Trump. Surveys that use home addresses to recruit their respondents are a bit more trustworthy. They have the lowest number of bogus respondents. And finally, you need to look closely at how a question is worded. Questions that are leading, loaded, confusing, or filled with jargon can throw off a whole poll, and sometimes that's the intent. And a question that is open-ended versus closed-ended will sometimes have widely different results. For example, here are 2 versions of a Pew poll conducted after the presidential election in 2008. When explicitly offered the economy as an option, 58% chose that answer, while only 35% of those who responded the open-ended version chose the issue of the economy. So, that matters because an open-ended question can offer a lot more insight into what voters are thinking about, where a closed-ended question is focused only on the options given. Also, keep in mind who sponsored and paid for the poll, and look to see if the pollster shows his or her work in data beyond just the final numbers. So with me now to talk the good, the bad, and the ugly of polling are Republican pollster Brad Todd and Democratic pollster and NBC News political analyst Cornell Belcher. And I wanted to focus particularly on state-level polling. This is what you guys do for a living. And I know particularly, actually both of you constantly complain to me about public state polling, and it's awful. So here's your chance to explain why it stinks. Cornell Belcher, let me start with you. Why are the public national polls, there are a lot of good ones. The public state polls, it's been a struggle. Cornell, why?
Well, I'll go back to what you were just talking about here. I think from a campaign standpoint, from the voter file standpoint, one of the problems is who's voting, who's not voting. When I'm doing state level polling, we spend a lot of time on the voter file, and actually, Chuck, some of these voter files are actually pretty good because we've gotten better at it, especially at least on the Democratic side, going back to Howard Dean. You remember Dean came in and we spent a lot of money like getting all the state voter files together and putting them all in one place and updating them. And the party has done a fairly good job of that. We were playing catch up with the Republicans on that piece for a while. But if you look, I can look at a voter file and I can say, okay, these are the people who tend to vote in this type of elections. And actually the presidential on-year elections are the easiest one because you have so many people voting. What's more difficult at the state level is actually like you have a governor's race in an off year because you have tremendous pullback of voters who are voting in the off year. So that vote history really does matter, and being able to look at vote history and intentions really does matter, but also having a deeper understanding of the state and what kind of race it is. For example, if you have for the first time a Latino woman running for governor, in one of your Western states with a burgeoning population of Latino voters. This is the art of it. Are the Latino numbers going to stay the same this race as they have been historically? This is what the art of polling and the good pollsters from just the academic pollsters. This is what makes a difference, because you look at that and go, you know what? Given the energy level of this, I'm gonna probably let more Latino voters in who I would not traditionally let in if I didn't have sort of this exciting Latino woman at the top of the ticket. But it is all of these little measures that I think we do that's part of the art.
Brad, give me your answer on this. And is it a reason? Do you think it's a financial reason when it comes to these state polls that we just, whether it's the academics or the media, we don't have the money?
I think it's a couple things. I think number one, finances play a role. I mean, public polling in states, it's cheap programming for news outlets for the most part, and therefore, the more they spend on it, the less interested they are in it. It gets the same amount of minutes in the newscast, whether it's cheap or expensive. And so I think that's the first criteria. I think the second problem is just length of understanding. As you mentioned, when you parachute in and take one poll in a state in a Senate race, you really don't know what your data is when you get it back. And so you're going to make judgments on weighting that data without really any perspective, because you don't have any longitudinal data, as Bill McIntyre was just talking about, for is this state changed? And is what I'm seeing here not an anomaly, but the new reality? And I think third is the motivation. We end up with a lot better polling, I think, on the private side, both in partisan data at state levels, because the people who are taking the polls are motivated to not be wrong. They don't get rehired next time in that state unless they develop an expertise in that state. And media pollsters tend to not get fired even if they're wrong. So I think that really it hits all three points. Cornell's right. It is art. The art of deciding what your assumptions are is the real magic of polling. You have to, there are decisions you make before you make the first phone call.
Yeah. Listen, there's a ton I want to get to, but I only have about a minute in how I've constructed this segment. So I'm going to ask you both this. Is there one method of polling that you would never do that you see is a common, all too often? Brad, let me start with you. Quick answers. CNN has a real problem. They start out with all adults, and they set their frame to all adults. Then they go to registered voters. Then they look at likely voters. So by the time you get to likely voters, it doesn't really resemble what you started for. That drives me crazy. Cornell, what's the worst methodology you commonly see?
Really quickly, and I rail against this all the time, because I go back to my college professor friends, and they go, Cornell, they can't pull a random sample, a representative sample online. So the fundamentals of randomness, for which all polling is based on, the theory of randomness, that's not being applied on online polling. So I just don't believe in online polling. They're pulling samples, but they're not necessarily representative samples.
Oh, you both actually picked on two things that also bother me, so I'm glad we picked those. Brad Todd, Cornell Belcher, a Republican and a Democrat, but two guys that agree on the art of polling. Thank you both. Up ahead, why I'm obsessed with reading the fine print in polls. Finally, I'm obsessed with the bottom line. One that's usually pretty difficult to see.
In all reality, we know that these polls are within the margin of error.
Within the margin of error. Within the margin of error.
Within the margin of error.
The margin of error.
Within the margin of error.
Margin of error. The giant asterisk of election polling. In teeny tiny little type. The great crutch of journalists who don't know much about polling. It's often spoken of, but rarely understood. So let's break it down in plain English. The margin of error is essentially a small percentage that assumes a potential miscalculation in polling. It allows for the possibility that the poll numbers may be slightly different than reality, in one direction or the other. But here's what you really need to know. Let's say a candidate gets 48% of voter support in a poll with a margin of error of 3.5%. That means his or her number could really be as low as 44.5% or as high as 51.5%. But it's not an equal chance. It's just a possibility. That's what the 3.5 points in either direction means. In other words, practically speaking, there's a pretty big margin of error in the margin of error. You have to double it, but even then, with a caveat. Now let's say candidate A is 48% support and candidate B is 42% support. Is that a tied race? The potential swing of each of those numbers could be 7%. And that means there is a slim possibility that candidate B is actually ahead. But that's a big if. Still, it is an if, one that you can't ignore. And that begs the question. If the margin of error could have such a significant impact on how a poll is read, why is it always in that miniature font, hidden in plain view at the bottom of the poll, forgotten and dispensed with like so much rubbish, like the rapid-fire side effects in a pharmaceutical ad?
Side effects of Marginex may include diminished sample size, random polling, non-responsiveness, question loading, statistical averageness, electile dysfunction, and lactose intolerance.
Really, we need to rethink the margin of error entirely to factor in all of the variables that we've mentioned earlier. Not just who gets polled, but how they get polled. Polls with better data should have lower margins of error, right? And let's be sure to put it in a font size where we can actually all see it and read it and get it. Or if we can't spare the space, at the very least, then slap on a warning label. That's all we have for Meet the Press Reports. Join us next time when we may actually know who won the presidential election and who didn't. So we're actually going to take an in-depth look at the art and the impact of the concession speech, how candidates can lose and still win. Hey, thanks for being with us. I'll see you Sunday on Meet the Press. Hey, thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.